There are certain names that, the moment you hear them, transport you straight back to a specific era. Don Johnson is one of those names. Say it out loud and suddenly you are back in the pastel suits, Ferrari engines roaring down sun-soaked streets, and a television screen filled with the kind of cool that simply cannot be manufactured or faked under any circumstances. Don Johnson did not just star in Miami Vice. He was Miami Vice. He was the entire decade personified in one single human being. Confident, magnetic, effortlessly stylish, and seemingly untouchable by the ordinary problems that plagued lesser mortals who occupied the same industry and the same era. But here is the thing about being untouchable. Life has a remarkable and almost poetic way of humbling even the most glamorous and seemingly invincible among us. And the story of Don Johnson is not simply a Hollywood rise and fall tale, though it certainly contains all those familiar elements in abundance. It is something far more human and far more complex than that. It is the story of a boy who came from absolutely nothing, who clawed his way to the very top of the entertainment world with sheer force of personality and genuine talent, then watched nearly everything he had so painstakingly built slip through his fingers in ways that were both predictable and utterly heartbreaking. And then, somehow, against considerable odds and despite mountains of evidence suggesting the story was completely finished, he found within himself the strength and the determination to rebuild from the ground up. Today old, Don Johnson is still standing, still working, still relevant in an industry that discards people with breathtaking regularity and absolutely no remorse. And the journey that brought him to this particular point in his life is one of the most fascinating, complicated, painful, and ultimately inspiring stories that American entertainment has ever produced. Most people only know the highlights, the white suit, the permanent stubble, the swagger that seemed to cost him nothing to produce. But the full story is so much richer and darker and more redemptive than any highlights reel could ever begin to suggest. To truly appreciate where Don Johnson is today, you have to understand the full arc of where he has been. And that arc begins a very long way from Hollywood. To truly understand the weight and significance of what Don Johnson eventually lost, you first have to understand where he started and what he came from, because he did not begin anywhere near the top of anything. He was not a child of privilege or comfort. He did not grow up surrounded by connections or encouragement or any of the resources that tend to make the path to success a little less brutal. He was born in Flat Creek, Missouri, a small and unremarkable town in the American heartland, situated as far from Hollywood glamour or entertainment industry opportunity as it is possible to get geographically and culturally. His mother was barely a teenager when she brought him into the world, and his father was only marginally older. They were essentially children themselves, raising a child together while struggling to make ends meet in a way that left very little room for stability or emotional warmth or the kind of nurturing household environment that typically sets a person up for confidence and security later in life. Money was tight. Tension was constant. And the young boy growing up in the middle of it all absorbed all of that difficulty into his developing sense of self in ways that would take him decades to fully process and understand. The family eventually relocated to Wichita, Kansas, and that is where Don spent the formative years of his childhood and adolescence. By his own later accounts, given freely in numerous interviews over the years, it was not a happy or particularly easy upbringing by any standard measure. His parents divorced when he was around 12 years old, and the emotional fallout from that fracture hit him deeply and left lasting damage. He was the oldest child in the household, which meant he was expected in some unspoken way to hold things together even as everything around him continued to come apart at the seams. The responsibility was too heavy for someone that young, and the loneliness that came with it was profound. By the time he was 16 years old, he had made the decision to leave home entirely, stepping out into a world he was completely and utterly unprepared for in practical terms, armed with nothing but a desperate and burning hunger for something better than what he had known and a natural personality that simply refused to go unnoticed in any room it entered. It was an act of courage and desperation in equal measure, and it could easily have ended in disaster. For a while, honestly, it very nearly did. What saved him, in many ways, was an almost entirely accidental encounter with the performing arts during his final years of high school. Needing additional academic credits to meet graduation requirements, he signed up for a drama class without any particular enthusiasm or intention behind the decision. It was purely practical. But his teacher immediately recognized something quite extraordinary in a young man sitting in front of her. A raw, magnetic, almost uncontainable energy that most trained performers spend entire careers trying to develop and never quite manage to fully achieve. He was cast in a school production, given a significant role that put him at the center of the stage, and the moment he stepped out under those lights and felt the genuine response of a live audience, something fundamental and irreversible shifted inside him. The approval and the attention and the sense of being truly seen and valued filled a space inside him that had been hollow and aching for most of his young life. He realized, perhaps for the first time with any real clarity, that he possessed something that people wanted to watch and respond to. Something that commanded attention without effort. That discovery changed everything about the direction his life would take from that point forward. He pursued that feeling and that craft with everything he had from that moment on. He earned a partial scholarship to study drama at a university level, dedicating himself to the formal study of acting with the single-mindedness of someone who has finally found the thing they were put on earth to do. He later moved on to one of the most respected and rigorous acting institutions on the West Coast, where serious craft was taught by serious people and where the real work of becoming a professional performer truly began. The path to Hollywood was taking shape, slowly and with considerable difficulty, but unmistakably. What frequently gets glossed over or compressed in the popular narrative of Don Johnson's life is the sheer length of time he spent grinding away in relative obscurity before his defining moment finally arrived. He was not a young prodigy who arrived in Los Angeles and became famous within a year or two through some combination of luck and good looks. Throughout the late 60s and well into the 70s, he was doing exactly what the vast majority of working actors do for most of their careers, taking whatever roles he could find, doing television guest spots that nobody particularly remembered, going on audition after audition, getting rejected with numbing regularity, and somehow finding within himself the motivation to continue despite all available evidence suggesting that Hollywood was not especially interested in elevating him to the level of stardom he clearly believed he deserved and was capable of achieving. He appeared in a number of low-budget independent productions during this period, including one film that developed a devoted cult following among enthusiasts of a particular genre and earned him a small but genuine degree of recognition among that specific audience. But mainstream success and the kind of fame that changes a person's life completely remained frustratingly and persistently out of reach. For well over a decade, Don Johnson existed in that particularly painful and demoralizing liminal space occupied by someone who is clearly talented, clearly has an undeniable quality that sets them apart, but has not yet found the specific vehicle that allows the world to see it properly. He was approaching his mid-30s, an age at which many actors begin to quietly accept that the big break is simply not coming, before everything finally and completely changed. The change arrived in the form of a television series built around a visual language and cinematic ambition that nobody had ever seriously attempted on the small screen before. Don was cast as the central character, a Florida detective with a complicated and troubled personal history, a naturally impeccable sense of style, and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow that photographers could not get enough of. The show became a genuine cultural phenomenon almost immediately upon its debut, with a speed and completeness that surprised even the most optimistic people involved in its production. It did not simply attract viewers in large numbers. It created devoted, passionate followers. People did not merely watch it as entertainment. They organized their personal wardrobes and sense of style around what they saw on screen, debated its storylines with genuine investment, and treated its leading man as something approaching a living symbol of a particular kind of cool that the decade desperately wanted to claim as its own. Don Johnson became a household name with a totality and speed that very few entertainers in any era ever experience. His face appeared on the covers of the most widely read magazines in the country. Fashion designers took direct and acknowledged inspiration from the clothing choices made on his behalf for the show. His specific personal aesthetic, the linen blazers worn over light-colored shirts, the deliberate and now iconic absence of socks, became the single most recognizable style signature of the entire decade, copied by millions of people across the world who wanted to carry a small piece of that particular brand of effortless cool into their daily lives. He was earning extraordinary sums of money per episode, and the show ran for 5 highly successful seasons, carrying him from the status of struggling and nearly forgotten actor to that of genuine, undeniable Hollywood royalty in what felt from the outside like almost no time at all. The contrast with his previous decade of obscurity and near misses could not have been more dramatic or more complete. And he did not stop at television stardom. Deciding that being the most famous actor on television was an insufficient use of his creative energy, he ventured into music, releasing a full album that was widely and somewhat condescendingly expected by critics to be a vanity project of the most transparent kind, and which proceeded to surprise and embarrass those critics by actually connecting with audiences in a genuine way and climbing the charts to a respectable position. He performed live concerts to enthusiastic audiences. He recorded collaborative tracks with some of the most established and respected names in the music business. Whether or not any serious person considered him a genuinely significant musical artist, the undeniable point was that Don Johnson had apparently discovered the ability to turn his attention toward almost any creative endeavor and find a willing and enthusiastic audience for the results. By the close of the 80s, the picture looked complete and almost impossibly perfect. The hit television show, the music career. The movie offers arriving with regularity. The multiple magnificent properties. The extraordinary automobile collection. The glamorous social circle. The lifestyle calibrated to the absolute maximum expression of wealth and fame and success. The Kansas boy who had left home at 16 with nothing had apparently conquered everything. When you are that famous, that wealthy, and possess the kind of natural magnetism that Don Johnson carried through the world, your personal life tends to become every bit as dramatic and complicated as anything happening in your professional one. His romantic history across the full span of his adult life is, to put it with some generosity, a complicated and turbulent narrative filled with passion and impulsiveness and the particular kind of chaos that seems to seek out people who are accustomed to getting whatever they want. He married multiple times. 2 of those marriages were so brief and so clearly driven by pure impulse that they were annulled almost immediately after they happened, and the details surrounding both have remained largely and perhaps mercifully private across all the intervening decades. They are footnotes in a much larger story. The genuine emotional centerpiece of his romantic life, the relationship that kept reassembling itself despite all apparent logic and circumstance and the passage of significant time, was with a fellow actress who had been in the industry since she was very young. They met when both of them were at early stages of their respective careers and lives, on a film set, and the chemistry between them was immediate and overwhelming and apparently impossible for either of them to simply walk away from despite the complications it created. They married in the mid-70s and separated within months, in a collapse that seemed to confirm what outside observers had suspected about the relationship's fundamental instability. It appeared finished. Done. Consigned to the category of youthful mistakes made by people who should have known better. But the heart, as has been observed by wiser people than anyone involved in this particular story, does not reliably follow the instructions of logic or common sense. Years later, after considerable time had passed and both individuals had grown and changed in significant ways, they found their way back to each other with a determination that suggested the connection between them was more substantial and more durable than their first attempt had managed to prove. They remarried and built a family together, welcoming a daughter who would grow up to become, in her own right, one of the most recognizable and genuinely talented actresses working in Hollywood today. The pride Don takes in her success is among the most authentic things about his current public persona. But even that second attempt at building something lasting could not ultimately hold together against the accumulated pressures of 2 complicated lives lived very much in public, and they eventually parted ways for the final time. Despite everything, despite all the starts and stops and the years of difficulty between them, they remained connected, bound together by their daughter and by what Don has described in interviews as a kind of love that does not simply cease to exist when a marriage ends but instead transforms over time into something different, something quieter and more sustainable. He also maintained a significant long-term relationship with another woman during the period between his marriages, a relationship that lasted for several years and produced a son who would eventually follow his father into the acting profession. And there were other relationships along the way, some brief, some extended, some that generated considerable public attention and commentary for various reasons, including significant differences in age that the tabloid press found irresistible as material. After all of it, after decades of romantic turbulence and headline-generating entanglements and marriages that ended badly, Don Johnson did something that genuinely surprised the people who thought they understood him. He settled down. He chose a woman who existed entirely outside the Hollywood world he had inhabited for 30 years, a former preschool teacher with a calm and grounded presence and a completely different set of values and priorities than the glamorous and often chaotic figures who had populated his romantic life up to that point. Their marriage has endured for more than 2 decades now, producing 3 children together and providing Don with the kind of stable emotional foundation that he had been searching for, consciously or otherwise, since he was a teenager in Kansas. He has spoken warmly and repeatedly about how her presence fundamentally transformed his relationship with stability and peace and the possibility of genuine contentment. But before any of that hard-won peace arrived, there was a long and genuinely destructive period that Don Johnson has since spoken about with a degree of honesty and self-awareness that commands a certain respect. Because it would have been very easy, and very human, to minimize or rationalize or reframe what happened during those years. He has largely chosen not to do that. When you rise as fast and as completely as he did, the temptations that accompany that ascent are not modest or easily resisted. The social world of Hollywood during the height of his fame was a place where excess was normalized, where the boundaries between celebration and self-destruction were deliberately blurred, and where substances of various kinds were as readily available and casually consumed as any other aspect of a lifestyle. Don did not hold himself apart from that world. He entered it fully and with apparent enthusiasm, using the constant stimulation and the various available substances as a way of managing the pressure and the anxiety and the profound emotional wounds he had been carrying since long before anyone had ever heard his name. What began as participation in a culture that surrounded him on all sides became, over time, genuine dependency. The effects began to bleed into his professional conduct and his personal relationships in ways that were increasingly difficult to hide or explain away. His behavior became erratic in ways that cost him both professional opportunities and personal relationships that mattered to him. He eventually sought treatment, and the road back to sobriety was neither quick nor smooth nor accomplished without significant struggle and setback along the way.